Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Samira, welcome along to the You Can Talk to Me Beatles podcast. A real pleasure to sit with you.
Pleasure for me too. Thank you so much for having me on.
If we could go back in time, I once read a quote from you, and you'll tell me if I have this incorrect. My fascination with the intersection of popular culture and social change is the driving force behind my journalism. I'm just curious, what is it about that specific passion and that motivation that is special to you? Where does that come from, do you think?
Well, I identified this as a passion of mine around 2010. And I think it was when, we had the big change of government here and the so-called austerity years where the coalition government made huge cuts. It was shutting down libraries and all kinds of cultural things were shutting down. At the same time, Downton Abbey became one of the biggest shows on TV. And I thought, why do we go for nostalgia at a time of economic crisis? And I had been reading the books Laura Ingalls Wilder. She wrote them during the Great Depression. They really resonated with Americans at that time, and they were about the pioneer days. So I thought straight away, there's something about popular culture which often reveals what's happening in society at large. And when you were conscious of it, you realise that most of the amazing stories I've done have been by spotting that and looking at, why are we fascinated with this particular pop star right now? What does it reveal about us right now? Sometimes the political background is going on behind it. And I found that when I wrote this book about the Beatles too, there was so much by looking at them through the prism of social change, what that popular culture moment meant. It wasn't just that the Beatles were a great band, it was what they changed and what was changing in Britain regardless that made it possible.
It's a wonderful take on things. And I've shared this story before in the pod, but I have to tell it again for you. My father was dating my mother in Melbourne in the mid-60s, and he was a guitar player and introduced me to music and the Beatles as a young boy. But he told this story of going to pick Mum up for a date. She worked in this retail store, and he's in the city, he goes in, and there's a transistor radio playing, and people are going about their shopping. And the radio announcer comes on and says, and coming up now, the latest single from the Beatles. We hope you enjoy it. And he said he'd never seen this again in his life. The store went quiet. People kind of stopped conversing and everyone stopped moving and turned their ears to the counter, and Day Tripper started. And he described hearing that guitar for the very first time and being captivated. And the idea that people would stop what they were doing just to hear that thing. I remember reading Paul Weller describing hearing Strawberry Fields Forever on his radio when he was driving through Britain in 67, and he had to pull the car over because he said, I just couldn't take it in. Such an amazing time.
Mike, you're not going to believe this. I was driving home from the swimming pool this morning for this, and Day Tripper was playing on the radio, and I was listening to it thinking, yes. And I was thinking, what an amazing guitar track. And I was thinking about George Harrison, and I was thinking about, the Paul Weller and the Jam and the way that they, very much mimic some of those chords. But it's still a bit of a showstopper. But I love that insight, into this is how people behaved around the Beatles at the time, that their music was an event when a new single arrived. So it's a great, great family story to have.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go into the Beatles from the perspective of cultural history, particularly in Britain, and I know this is a very broad question, but I'm just curious from your perspective, particularly with the book, what do you think it is about the Beatles for Britain that there's this relevance and meaning that resonates? I remember just watching you not long ago sitting with Paul and talking about Liverpool and how Liverpool informed much of him and how much of them informs much of the city. I'm just curious from your own unique perspective, why do you think it is that we continue to remain fascinated?
So I think the mythology, the story of the Beatles is like the Odyssey or the Iliad. It's folkloric. I go to Liverpool every so often for work and various things, and I was there a few weeks ago, and I went to the Beatles Story, that museum in the Albert Docks, which is their history. And they've got a reconstruction of the trailer that the quarryman was standing on at the Wilton Village fete that summer in the 50s when John first met Paul. And I thought, from there on, they're war babies. They're born during the Second World War and all the rest of it. there's a whole mythology here that is a kind of chronology of the mid-20th century. And I was joking with a couple of people that, the Rolling Stones have written some great songs. By great coincidence, Get Off of My Cloud was also playing on the radio as I was driving home today. And but their story doesn't feel like, it's not in the ether, it's not part of our social history. And the Beatles story is, the fact that they went so fast from those leathered boys in Hamburg to the mop top era, to the psychedelic era, to the hippie, hairy era. I mean, it's like you couldn't make this stuff up, but it reads like a kind of great epic folk story. And it's entered the folklore. Everyone's got an opinion. Everyone knows something about their story. And the fact that they changed, there was stuff that happened to them during their time, Brian Epstein's death, their dabblings with Maharishi. All of that is, again, it's like the fabric of how Britain is changing, and they bring some of that. The whole fascination with Eastern philosophy and Indian culture, the Beatles are central to that happening in Britain, I think.
Again, so well put. We go back to November, I believe it was, 2021, and you truly beautifully navigate this conversation with Sir Paul and Paul Muldoon on the release of the lyrics book. It must have been a thrilling time for you. I think my favourite moment is when you're asking about living in the Asher household and talking about the gold records under the bed, and he's not quite sure if that's a memory or not. And you remind him that it's in the Miles sanctioned biography many years from now.
Right.
And he has this moment of, oh, well, then it must be true. And there's this levity there. And again, I was just captivated by how you were able to navigate all those moods and hold that together as well as you did. Could you share a little bit of that experience for our listeners of what that was like? And if I have it right, the South Bank Centre Stage was the venue?
Yes, it was the Royal Festival Hall, which is this kind of big concert hall. So the first thing was I got an email out of the blue in something like August 2021 from Penguin Random House, from someone saying, we've got this thing coming up and we thought you might be perfect to interview Paul McCartney. Would you be interested? It's like, I couldn't believe that they had asked me. And then very quickly they said, we'll have to check that. He's happy with that. We very quickly got back. Yes, he's very happy. So they sent me an advance copy of the book. And I basically, from August until November, Mike, I kid you not, all I did was listen to music by Paul McCartney and the Beatles. I read every book I could find on him and them. I read, Mike, who is the guy who wrote the Miles?
Barry Miles.
Barry Miles, right. Yes, the Barry Miles, basically approved biography. I read loads of things. I watched every interview I could find with him, including, the Wings era and so on. So I felt that I had absorbed so much information over a long time that it was just there. It's like going into an exam really well prepared. And so they didn't say anything was off limits, but they wanted an idea of questions. So I came up with a structure of questions that I worked on over several weeks. And the key for me, and it's true with any interview, but with this one in particularly, is you don't want to go in nervous. You want to go in so prepared that you're relaxed. And that's how I approached it. Although it's quite funny, in the green room, while I was waiting just before, I suddenly had this last minute, like just before an exam, you think, oh my God. And I had been able to pick 2 tracks to play little extracts of, to play to the auditorium, although they're not on the live stream because of copyright issues. And one of the tracks I chose was I Saw Her Standing There, which is, I think, track 1, side 1 of Please Please Me. It seemed really relevant. And the other was a solo track about riding a bus, which had all kinds of historical resonance to his youth. And I thought, oh my God, is it track 1, side 1 of the debut album? So while we're standing in the wings, I said to Paul McCartney, look, I'm just trying to remember, is this a side 1, track 1? And he went, I don't remember either. And that's the whole thing about Paul McCartney. That's why he'll never write his own autobiography, because how could he possibly remember that level of detail when he's lived such a long and rich life? And there's millions of people out, and I think we joke that there's 2,500 people out in the auditorium who will know the answer. So there's the facts of where he was and when are known by enough people. There's, it's recorded. So he doesn't need to worry about that stuff. But, I think one of the things we all realise, and I appreciate it, particularly after that question you just raised, Mike, is memory is not a fixed thing. It's constantly changing, and we rewrite it and we sort of embellish it. And that's actually maybe that example where he'd just completely forgotten this thing that had happened. And it was almost a bit of a shock, because you assume that if you remembered something once, you'll always remember it, but you don't. But the whole experience was lovely. He was very, there was nothing was off limits. He was very warm, and we got a few new stories. And I think it's no criticism of Paul to say after so many interviews, sometimes he will say things that you've heard before. And the story about riding the buses across the city of Liverpool with George to learn about a new chord, and that this was all because of the new government transport system, which was very cheap. It was brought in by Herbert Morrison, I think was kind of a transport minister. But this was a big part of the post-war Liverpool in which these boys grew up, in which there was huge amounts of civic investment. They had free education. They could have gone to university if they'd wanted. They didn't have tuition fees and all that stuff. And public transport was cheap, so you could get across town for gigs, which is what they did.
It's an amazing piece, and it's one of those things when you finish watching it, you're just happy it's in the world and that there's intelligent questions and he's engaging with intelligent answers.
Oh, thank you. I had someone moan that I didn't ask enough about wings, and I thought, oh, for God's sake,
There was someone in the audience calls out while you're giving questions from audience members or people that have sent through, and you're very polite with, thank you, that we're not doing that, we're doing this, but appreciate that. And you hear someone in the audience yell out, shut up, but you never break a sweat. It's so beautifully handled, and you seem to be up there by his side on the exit when it was all done. You seem to have that level of intimacy where you're able to accompany him on the way out. What was the energy like with him for you?
It was really lovely. I mean, obviously, I was nervous about meeting him for the first time, and they held me. I had my own dressing room, and there was a point where they said, "Right, now come and say hello to Paul." So I did, and we did a sound check together on the stage, which is what really was lovely. So I could say to people, "I have done a sound check with Sir Paul McCartney," and it was very relaxed because you have the whole auditorium to yourselves. What was really interesting about him is he is so curious about performance. So I mentioned that I knew he'd been to the Royal Festival Hall with Jane Asher because they'd gone to see, I think, Ravi Shankar or someone perform there. I looked at what he'd done. And so I said, what it meant to him. And I said, I saw Iggy Pop here at the Royal Festival Hall do a gig. And he was straight away, what was Iggy Pop like? He was really curious because Iggy Pop, what an act to be doing that in the Royal Festival Hall. So I got the sense that he's, and we know this, he loves performing, he loves writing music, he lives to do what he's always done. That really came across. It made me feel very at ease. But afterwards, when we came off stage, he said thank you, and I didn't expect it because I wasn't looking at him. He just leaned over and gave me a kiss on the cheek, and I thought, this is the Paul McCartney who would have charmed his aunties. There's something very, he's an absolute sweetheart of a man. And what thing meant to me most in a weird way was his daughters were there with their children, and they came up to me afterwards. And Stella was in tears, and she said that's the best interview anyone's ever done with my dad.
Well, that's fantastic.
And that meant a lot to me, Stella and Mary. And he's just a man who's close to his children, and he's like a patriarch in the loveliest way. He's proud of his children, he's proud of his grandchildren. He just tells me all about them.
Yeah, what a great validation for you there. That's what a memory.
I know. I didn't sleep that night. I did not sleep that night.
If we go back again to a couple of years later, 2023, and that was when I first became aware of you, as I'm sure for many Beatle freaks, became, he says, 57 years of age, looking at his toy collection. But I became aware of you then and thought, what a fascinating story around this discovery. And I know you've probably been asked many times about this, but I'm trying to pack a lot in with you, so I kind of wanted to hit all these moments. But March 2023, you're presenting for BBC Radio 4's Front Row program. There's a focus on the 60th anniversary of the Beatles playing live, a 22-song set at Stowe School in Buckinghamshire. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
That was April 4, 63. I'd never heard of this even occurring. Correct me if I'm wrong, going into that project, there was no awareness that there's a recording existing at all at that time, was there?
It turns out that there were rumours, and including in some Beatles fan sites and things, about whether they had been recorded, and yet it wasn't something that was known about. I mean, Mark Lewison, who is the world's great Beatles historian and has become a great friend of mine, I did tell him, consulted him about it, and he said, oh, well, of course, it would have been an amazing concert, but there's no recording. And I went, well, actually, I think there might be. So he wasn't aware of it. But if you've read his book, Tune In, it has a kind of request at the end which says, look, there must be more recordings and documentation out there, and I think more stuff will turn up, and if you find anything, would you let me know? And this was one of those examples, and it was like one of these great missing pieces where it enables you to connect the Beatles as a gigging band who've come back from Hamburg. So they're doing some of those R&B numbers. They're also writing their own songs. They've just released their debut album. So it captures the Beatles at this moment of transition, like becoming from the kind of what do you call it, the pupa stage to the butterfly stage. The chrysalis to the butterfly. And because it's a boys' school, although they get pretty excited and exuberant over the course of that hour, by the end they are pretty much screaming. You can hear the band very clearly because the boys are pretty well behaved and they're not screaming like a typical concert. So in every sense, it was an amazing find. And John Bloomfield, who's the person who made the recording, who's become a very good friend, he's such a thoughtful man. And the fact that he then gave it to the British Library so it's there in the public ownership rather than disappearing into the vault of a collector is really significant. So I think it's an important piece of documentation for the future. And it's the closest we've got at the moment to knowing what it was like to be at a Beatles concert, even if it was a very unusual one where they were taking requests and, George doesn't sing any numbers because he's lost his voice,
Just remarkable. And do you mind, is it John Bloomfield, you were saying, was the young man at the time that made the recording? Would you mind just sharing a little bit of his own story? What even motivated him to think, this is a thing that I'll do?
So he was always a bit of a tech head, and he was a privileged young man. He'd been given a very fancy tape recorder for a birthday present quite recently, and he was the stage manager at the school theatre. So the concert was his thing. He would be setting it up anyway. He was a bit miffed, he said. He wasn't really aware of the Beatles at the time, and his band was supposed to be playing the Easter concert. So it was like, who are these Beatles who are playing our gig? But I don't know what gave him the inkling that he thought I should rig up my tape recorder and try it out. So he borrowed a microphone from the school's sort of supplies, rigged it up on the stage, put his tape player under the stage and set it going and took his place in the auditorium. So that's why the tape runs out a couple of songs before the end, so we don't quite remember how the concert ended. But yeah, and he went on to work in the music industry and the lighting industry, I think in particular. So he's always been a bit of a tech head, and I love that. Yeah, he just thought, why shouldn't I record it? And I think he just thought he would record it out of curiosity. It wasn't to keep it as a great souvenir. I mean, I think he even forgot about it for many years, but there it was, waiting to be discovered.
Incredible story. And there's also a recording made in the canteen, as I understand.
Yes. I mean, doesn't it reveal something? A bit like your story of your dad and the record shop or the shop and all the music stopping, or everyone stopping to listen to the music, that the dad who ran the tuck shop, he was a manager, so he was a kind of member of staff. He and his wife had been asked, would you provide dinner for the Beatles? And so they had been paid by some of the schoolboys to do that. They made a roast chicken dinner. And the father, of his own initiative, set up his own tape recorder in a flower pot on the dining room table. So they had, it's a very noisy recording, lots of clutter. But again, there is a copy of it that the family kept. They brought to me after hearing the Stowe tape story. And again, I've met them all since, and it's an amazing tale. But Mark Lewison thinks that this is a revelation about how the adult generation discovered the Beatles, because they were on shows like Morecambe and Wise or Thank Your Lucky Stars, and they were so charming and engaging, and so they fascinated adults too. And maybe he realised that this is worth something in terms of just wanting to record the moment that the Beatles came through my tuck shop.
It's also foreshadowing Michael Lindsay Hogg dropping a microphone into a vase. Also,
I know. I mean, there's all kinds of issues about consent and whatever, which are problematic. But I don't think anyone minds that the recordings survive. And what's interesting about the tuck shop tape is Dave Moores, who was, the future manager of Liverpool FC, who'd booked them, who was so knowledgeable, who was from Liverpool himself, was asking them all these questions based on his reading in the pop press about, their gigs and who they'd written songs for. And they're revealing stuff about how, how many hours a night, they used to play 8 hours a night in Hamburg, and how John talks about failing at art school. I mean, they're quite frank, actually, about where they are and their recent past. And while it's all quite fresh in their memory, they're still so young. Fame has only hit them in the last 6 months to a year, hasn't it?
Yeah. Look, if we jump into where we are today, you've got a book, and it's focusing in on A Hard Day's Night and what makes that movie what it is, the Citizen Kane of hop films, as it was called. Yeah. And the book is part of a series for the British Film Institute's Film Classics series. That LP I read that you once called their greatest, as far as you were concerned at the time. And I know that can change on any given day. Before we talk about the book, what makes that album so special for you?
I think every single track on it is peak Beatles, and if I had to pick an era, I am a fan of this moment, 64 to 65, where they're in their pomp and they're still enjoying it. And the music is also quite interestingly transitional. I mean, for a start with the title track, A Hard Day's Night, it's so incredibly modern and looking into the future. And you think about the birds and psychedelia, which is all hinted at in there. And side 2 is actually my favourite side of the album, none of which is on the film soundtrack. They wrote so many great songs and only half of them are actually on the soundtrack to the actual movie. But things like Things We Said Today, I've described it as a kind of play for today. There's all kinds of human drama going on there. They're very sophisticated songs, and I love the sort of shimmering guitars on them. That are like shimmering curtains. Just there, and the play with melody. So often there's kind of minor keys and things, and the key changes. I just think it's just magnificent. I mean, I love all the albums, and some of my favourite track of all is on Rubber Souls. It's not as if the fact that it's my favourite album means I don't love other music, but they made more in some ways. But I just think it's perfect. It's a perfect album. The energy on it.
Completely. I've always said it's the perfect pop album in every way. When you do mention Rubber Soul, what's your standout track there for you? I'm curious.
You Won't See Me.
Yeah. What is it about that track?
So a couple of things. There's the wordplay. You won't see me has a double meaning, like you won't see me because I'm not going to see you, or you refuse to see me. So it's a song about about a difficult phase in a relationship, and obviously there's all kinds of speculation that it's about difficulties with Jane Asher at the time when her career is very successful, and Paul was quite jealous, and also and all the rest of it. But also, just if you listen to it as a piece of music, it's apparently the longest track they'd recorded to that point. The drumming on it, the harmonies on it, they're almost like older mocking of their youthful selves. Ooh la la la. But every element of its construction, and it sounds almost a bit baroque. Some of the music, it's completely mature. It's completely perfect. I could listen to that track again and again and again.
Yeah, again, so well said. I understand that A Hard Day's Night hit you at the age of 11, and I'd love to go back in time to what that experience was like for you, getting it for the first time and what it meant to you. Do you have a clear sense of that?
Do you mean of the film?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Christmas 1979, the BBC Two ran a whole season of Beatles films, including the Beatles at Shea Stadium, Help, Hard Day's Night, Yellow Submarine, Magical Mystery Tour, and Let It Be. And my brother, who was 5 years older, huge Beatles fan, taped all of the films off TV onto our Betamax tape player. We were early adopters. My dad had a video player of some kind from 1975. And I remember I live in my parents' old house. I bought it off my mum a few years ago. So I know the room that we had the video and the TV in, which is still down there. And I remember sitting there watching it, and even because we taped it off television, you get the ident of the BBC Two with snowflakes. So whenever I watched it, of whatever time of year, it was always Christmas. And I don't think I sat and watched it on transmission. I watched it after my brother taped it, and I just discovered all those films that way. That one and Help were my two favourites, with Yellow Submarine a close third. I watched Magical Mystery Tour once, loathed it at the time, didn't like the strippers, what were the Beatles doing leering at a stripper. And Let It Be was just such a downer. I mean, it's funny how different that seems to get back. So I watched that about once and then thought, no, I can't watch that. But I used to watch the other three in the Beatles at Shea Stadium quite a lot. And what's interesting is how I felt the urge to watch Hard Day's Night or Help every week. So I used to come in from school. I had just started senior school. And I used to come in from school and I used to put one of those films on at 4 p.m, watch it till 5:30, and only then would I go and do my homework. And I was transported in that time. I was transported to a period I had missed, transported to the energy. Something about Hard Day's Night being black and white made it kind of like, it's almost like science fiction. It's like another world, you know. And the joy of it, I think there's something about them appealing to school children because they are a gang, aren't they? They behave a bit like schoolboys. I mean, they're rude, but they're never that rude. And because that film is quite carefully done, so the comedy is dominant, there's no love interest, there's no kind of dodgy sexual politics to it, which to make you feel uncomfortable, to make your parents feel uncomfortable. And the music, I mean, you know, I loved the songs. There wasn't a thing I fast-forwarded through, which is often the case when you have a video. You never wanted to fast forward through that, and it just left you at the end. You felt you could start watching it again. The energy throughout that film just keeps you at a constant high, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. We often talked on this pod over the time that it's been running about, and it's always been out there. You mentioned before, the story has this myth status to it. It couldn't have been written better. The right people at the right time with the right set of skills to make the right thing happen. Richard Lester seems like he was born for that film in terms of the right man to be with those guys, to keep them on point. How important do you think Lester was to the legacy of that film? And why would you think so?
I think Richard Lester is absolutely central to that film being a great film, because he fought to direct it. He has said since he made it that he felt he was in sync with audiences at the time, that his heart beat at the same pace as young people. He was 10 years older than them, but he'd worked in television and advertising for 10 years. He'd started out at 22. So a bit like them, he'd been doing his 10,000 hours, hadn't he? As a very young man, and he had that energy. And he wasn't, I think it helps that he was a kind of outsider to their work, so he wasn't automatically a fan. He didn't really know their music. But the moment he met Walter Shenson and discussed the possibility of this film and fought to do it, he went off and got the album. He had friends who'd seen them at the Cavern. He got, a bit like I did Paul McCartney, he immersed himself in what was their music and their world. And of course, he went to see them at a recording quite early on. His first meeting was which is all in my book, at a theatre in the West End where they were recording a show for the BBC. And they arrived late, and there's chaos, and there's journalists and screaming fans, and the director is tearing his hair out with anxiety. And straight away, and then the Beatles turn up, and they are chill, and they calm everything, and they take it all in their stride. And he thought, this is the essence of them. So if you think about it, the film with Victor Spinetti playing a version of Richard Lester is actually all really ultimately inspired from something Richard Lester saw himself, which is the Beatles as they are, the way that people behave around them, and the way that they are the kind of calm centre of the storm. That's your film. You make a fictionalized version of it, but essentially you want to capture the Beatles. I mean, the working title was Beatlemania. You want to capture Beatlemania as it is, but their personalities shine through. And you got to know them well. The script was updated during shooting to reflect when they spotted actually George is rather a good actor. Let's give him an extra scene. Let's give him the scene in the bathroom with the shaving. They rewrote a scene which was in the original script that was. I mean, I don't know if the Beatles ever got to see it, but it's in my book. It's quite a racist written scene, and that's it would have been mean spirited. And one of the producers, Bud Ornstein, just said, nope, that's not going in. We have African American audience to think about, and there's no way that scene's going in. So it's taken out, and they replace it with the scene Ringo by the Riverside with the boy David Jansen, which is one of the great moments of the film. So there's a lot of serendipity to enough people have eyes on the script and the film to make sure that the odd thing which would have jarred just doesn't happen. So unlike nearly every other film of the era, even Billy Liar, which is a lovely film, has blackface and stuff in it. There's nothing like that in this. It is entirely, it's completely, there's not one mean-spirited thing in this film, I don't think.
I understand you met with David Jansen. How did you find him after all these years?
He's so recognisable. He may be in his 70s now, but he's one of those people who's very youthful. He's been an actor his whole life. He'd already been an actor for a couple of years when he made A Hard Day's Night. So he's got that professionalism about him. He's utterly charming. And he had great recollections. I mean, obviously he's been asked about it a fair amount over the time. And I think being so young, I think it helps because if we think about it, all of our earliest memories, they're laid down very deep, aren't they? Because when you're 10 years old, you've lived such a short time on Earth. And I think up until about your 20s, most of your memories are the strongest ones you have. So he had very clear memories, which he shared with me about not just the way that they shot his scenes, but the fact that he was supposed to be in another scene, which is one of the big reveals of my book, which I won't spoil for your listeners. But, there was supposed to be another scene he appeared in, and I think it was a mistake of Richard Lester to change that scene for the reasons that he did. But also, the way that the people behaved when he watched. There was always a crowd of journalists around the shoot whenever they were in public places, and they would give impromptu press conferences, and he watched the way adults would descend on the table where the Beatles had sat after a conference, and they'd be scrambling to pick up pieces of tissue paper or cigarette butts or ashtrays or anything they touched. And he witnessed that hysteria, I think, with bemusement as a child would. As a professional actor who's in the performing world, you kind of think, what are these adults doing? I thought that was all really interesting. And then the one thing which I was really touched by was he came to the book launch, which we did at the BFI, and there's cinemas there. We did a big screening in the BFI. main screen cinema, which seats about 400 people. So it's pretty much sold out. And he told me that he had never seen the film in the cinema before. He'd seen it on television or video, obviously, but no one had ever thought to invite him to the premiere. And so there he was in a cinema watching it on the big screen, 2 years after it was made. And it looks amazing. And he came with his daughter, who had not seen it, I think, on the cinema screen before. So it meant a lot to him, and it meant a huge amount to me. And obviously I introduced him to the audience. And David Jansen is in the hall, and he got a huge round of applause. And I don't know. There's something about seeing a film with someone watching their childhood self on screen. I mean, it's
remarkable stuff.
Yeah.
And you alluded to a moment there that was probably one of a number, I imagine, of aha moments. What was the process like for you from research to completion?
So I had a lot of opinions already about the film. So I knew I wanted to, for example, write a chapter about the women characters, and a lot of that was my own analysis. But there's so much documentation. Individuals have given interviews over the years. The anthology book that went with the original Beatles anthology series, which they did in the 1990s, was packed with their recollections of filmmaking. So there's lots of quotes from there. And then interviews with people like the cinematographer Gilbert Taylor in American Cinematographer magazine about 20 years ago. I mean, sadly, most of the people who worked on the film, although not Richard Lester, have passed away. And he had great detailed account of how they shot different things, why they shot things, like, the famous sequence of And I Love Her with Paul McCartney singing, and it's all beautiful and moody. They shoot it in high contrast black and white because the studio was so filthy. They wanted to hide the dirt. And you think those are unexpected moments. And then things like one of the assistant producers who revealed that John Lennon's dad, real dad, had turned up suddenly in the middle of filming at the Scala Theatre and demanded to be let in. I mean, it's a bit like the grandfather character banging on the door saying, "Let me in, I'm Paul's grandfather." That's what they all say. This actually happened. And after years, and that must have been so stressful. So basically, I did a huge amount of reading, and I just compiled all these facts. And then it was a matter of working out the ones you wanted to share and having quotations to back them. And the book is very rigorously sourced. Everything has a citation, because there's a lot of stuff out there that gets repeated and people think it's factual, but it's not true. So it was quite nice to be able to make sure that everything in the book is factually correct. And Mark Lewison very kindly agreed to be a consultant, which really made a difference to me. So I promise you, apart from the odd thing which has slipped through, which I will correct in future editions, I'm really happy with it. There's no big clangers in there. And there's stuff you honestly, even no matter how well you think you know the film, you will learn stuff that you did not know. And particularly things like it was an election year, what was going on politically in Britain, how that, there's that famous photograph of the Beatles with Harold Wilson at the Variety Club lunch. That was a few months before a general election. And, he wins the election later that year, and he knew that the Beatles were election gold. I mean, there's a whole story about how he and Ted Heath had different views about the Beatles and what they represented. I mean, it's, that goes back to the issue about social change through popular culture. The Beatles represent this youthquake. Young people under the age of 18-year-olds able to vote for the first time, I think, in 1964. So this is the election where teenagers suddenly have huge sway. And the Beatles obviously have huge sway on teenagers.
I read a quote from Paul recently where he described, I'm paraphrasing, it felt like before us, for teenagers, you grew up and you got a job and you did a thing. And then I think we represented freedom, that you could grow up and do, perhaps, and these are my words, perhaps be and do anything. I thought it was interesting to hear him kind of describe this idea that we represented freedom. What do you think of that?
I think he's right. I mean, they all in their own way defied the paths that had been marked out for them. And, I mean, in a way, it's shocking. I think as a parent myself, if my child has showed potential to go to university and said, I'm going to drop out of school, I'm not going to finish taking my A-levels, and I'm going to disappear off to Hamburg with some mates to be in a band, your heart would sink. But it happened to be the Beatles, and they made a huge success of it. But I think it's very interesting that, Paul's children and grandchildren all went to university, that he's encouraged them to take the opportunities that, I'm not saying he didn't have, but he perhaps, in a different line. People talk about Paul McCartney become a teacher, would he have gone and done English literature at university and become a teacher? I mean, it's really interesting to think of the choices they made. But certainly freedom in the sense of defying class expectations. There are these mouthy boys from lower middle class, working class backgrounds speaking the same way. They're not being rude to the posh people, but they're speaking the same way to posh people, the way that they would speak to their peers. That was really unprecedented in popular culture, to see that. Speaking in their own accents, not trying to speak posh, not trying to speak RP, the way that it was assumed that people had thought that film would be dubbed. I think that's all very liberating. And something that's liberating, I know I obsess about it, but the hair, the long hair that's different for each of them. It's exciting, not just for the girls, but for the boys too,
Yeah, absolutely. I've often wondered if Alan Owen gets enough flowers for the writing on that film.
No, I think he did, and I've seen him do interviews on, if you get the DVD, there's historic interviews with Alan Owen, and he was very respected at the time, and he went on to make a lot of great dramas as well. So, and I think the script has some absolutely cracking lines and moments in it. I was listening to a bit of an interview they did shortly after finishing filming, and they're all throwing lines from the script round at each other about, bourgeois cliches and things. And they're joking about these lines that they had to learn, that they were very conscious of being given a version of themselves through that script. But I think they enjoyed it. And they were clever enough to deal with it. The script, although it's written in short bursts so they could learn it quickly, scene by scene as they went along, it's got some big words and lines in it. I don't mean that in a patronising way. Not everyone can do that. They were natural performers. That's why it works. And he could write for them and with them because he was from Liverpool. He got the cadences, the rhythms, the way that they speak. Even if you didn't understand it, I didn't catch every word as a child watching that film. The rhythms of the way they speak to each other are incantatory, aren't they? They have a magical effect on you, just listening to the way they talk to each other.
Yeah. I remember seeing the stills of Paul with the wide-eyed look standing alongside a beautiful showgirl, and I understand it was a scene that didn't make Final Cut that Richard was playing with. Do you know much, and without spoiler territory, but do you know much about that?
Yeah, there's a whole thing in my book about. She's one of the women characters in the film that isn't there. So Isla Blair, who's I think still very much with us, very respected actress, plays a young actress in a rehearsal room who's in a kind of 18th century costume and is rehearsing for a scene. And Paul stumbles in while he's looking for Ringo. So they all had their own scenes while they're all going off looking for Ringo. George has the scene in the ad agency, and John has the scene with Anna Quayle and so on, and Ringo by the riverside. And this was supposed to be Paul's. And if you can get the script secondhand, it was published in the early 70s, and it's one of the books that I list in the bibliography in the back. And you can see the scene as it was written and shot. And it doesn't really add much. It's quite serious, but there's a lot of lines about how women can behave like scrubbers and stuff, which is just a bit weird and dated. It took 2 days to shoot. The camera was circling the two of them. So it's shot in quite a sophisticated way. And I guess the closest comparison tonally would be the scene where Ringo and the boy are at the riverside, which is it's quite a serious scene in a way, isn't it? What is the boy running away from? They're talking about being deserters and all the rest of it. So I think it's that kind of tone, but it doesn't really add anything. I think that Richard Lester was very... not scrupulous, what's the word? He was completely strict with himself about keeping the flow of energy. Yeah, keeping the flow of energy, ditching anything that wasn't essential. That's why they cut one of the songs that they recorded for the concert scene.
Can't do that?
Yeah, which only survived because a copy was made and given to Ed Sullivan to show as a preview on one of his shows. Because, of course, all the offcuts, all the deleted scenes in Twickenham Studios were thrown out in a clear-out in the late 60s, which is madness. They did the same with those scenes in Help with Wendy Richards and Frankie Howerd. So, so there'll never be a restored director's cut version of this film because all the extra scenes have disappeared. But it's interesting. Obviously one would love to have seen the scene. There are all kinds of things made out, Paul couldn't act, but I don't think it was that. I think it was quite a hard scene to do.
Yeah, you made me laugh. I heard you being interviewed recently, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but there was a comment around there's a lot of falling and things tipping in this film when you start to watch carefully, right from the opening credits with George, who hits the ground hard.
Yeah, and then Ringo goes down on top of him. I mean, it's hard. And if you watch it, because my first chapter of my book is a kind of DVD-style commentary where I go through it scene by scene. And if you watch, George gets up, he's laughing, but he looks at his wrist, he starts to rub it as he's running. I mean, he really hurt himself. And no health and safety assessment. I think he tripped on a paving stone or a corner of a drain pipe. But if he hadn't got up and kept running, what would have happened? The crowd would have arrived and mobbed them. And how would they have reset? So everything about that shoot is done really quickly, and then they move on before it gets too chaotic. And then similarly, there's a scene when they're rehearsing in the studio, and John Junkie kind of puts an amp down and plugs it in, and George leans on it and it tips and it makes an audible bang. I mean, there's moments like that throughout the film which just make you feel it's got a documentary realness to it, doesn't it? It's quite funny to spot them as well.
Where can people find the book? Because it's obviously something you're very proud of that no doubt fans are going to have a ravenous time with. Where best to seek it out?
Yeah, well, so it's published by Bloomsbury. You can get it from any bookshop. I said if you want to use a real bookshop, that you can order it in and they will order it in. It's published by Bloomsbury. There's a special edition in the US, which is the same book. But I suspect, and there's also an ebook, I should say, and I have narrated the audiobook, which if you want to hear me quote the Beatles with my beautiful Liverpool, no, I didn't try to talk Scouse. I'm afraid I just read it in my RP voice. But I narrate the audiobook. But you can order it from all the usual online retailers as well. And I'm really pleased actually how it's been doing. It's had some lovely reviews. Like people like, Tim Rice, as in Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. He read it and he sent me an email to say how much he loved it and how there's so much he learned from it. And he was like, a young man he was a teenager or a child in the 60s. And he said, I thought I knew everything there was to know. But there's a huge comparison in my book between the films of Cliff Richard and the Beatles. Because, of course, Cliff Richard and the Shadows were actually quite a big impact, had a huge impact and quite an influence on the Beatles, both musically and career-wise. Paul talked a lot about watching Cliff's career and how he did and the choices he made. And that's why they decided not to go to the States until they'd had a #1 single there, because he'd been a huge star here, but he never quite broke through in America. And the films he made were all made to that American formula, and none of them made the difference either. And there's quite a fun kind of contrast. If you look at Summer Holiday and you look at A Hard Day's Night, both of them start on modes of London transport, both of them start in black and white. There's 4 guys on that bus to the south of France. Why does Cliff Richard have to leave Britain to go somewhere to make something feel exciting? Why, when the Beatles can make Britain feel like you don't want to leave this place, this is an exciting place to be? That's one of the reasons that film is magical. Told Britain in 1964, this is the most exciting place in the world to be, and it connects to the whole picture of youth employment, like you were quoting Paul earlier. It wasn't just freedom the Beatles represented. There was more freedom. There was a huge growth in jobs. Young people could walk into jobs very easily. That whole generation of makeup artists and young female directors going into television, which I document in my book, that's all possible because these new industries are opening up in the entertainment services, television and cinema and music. Suddenly there are all these new jobs and possibilities, and, that's so exciting. It's all captured in this film.
I'm so glad your voice is out there. This is a great age for Beatles authorship, isn't it?
Do you not think there's this element, even if subconsciously, that we know the clock is ticking? We're so lucky to be alive at the same time as Paul and Ringo. They've been you and me, we were both born in the late 60s. Our whole lives have been marked by the presence of the Beatles. Even if the band broke up just before we can remember, they're that constant companion. And I do remember when George Harrison died in 2001, and just what a horrific shock it was. Obviously, John's murder was just so dark, and I think that partly reminded people to reappreciate the Beatles. I think in the 70s, certainly older critics were quite blasé about them and quite negative, and maybe we all now are much more appreciative of them, and that's a good thing. What will be interesting is the impact of those new films that are being made by Sam Mendes, which I'll be honest, I don't know how you feel about. I really hope they're good. I'm just so nervous. I've never seen, apart from the Hours and Times, I've never seen a film which has really successfully captured anything of the Beatles on screen. I almost feel The Real Thing is so perfect. Why documentaries are one thing, but to make fictional films about real people, I don't know. I feel it's tricky.
I try not to think too much about it and will just let myself walk in. I understand that it's also perhaps I'm not the target market.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are. I think there's an element of they want to put their version on record while they're all still around, and because it's a big deal to have got all four estates and people to agree. Yoko Ono for John's estate, and that's also why I'm nervous, because I have said this on record. I'll say it again. I think Cynthia and Julian Lennon have been so hard done by and wrong, and they've been written out of a story of which they were a central part. And a hard day's night, and I'm really proud of this. In the book, I talk a lot about, and Cynthia's book about John Lennon, John, is a major citation in my book. She talks about, what was going on in her life at the time. Julian Lennon was 1 year old when they were making this film. There's this whole myth in the film that they're all single, even though it wasn't a state secret. But I just think how strange to have been, a mother and a husband, mother to a man like that. Wife to a man like that, mother of their child, and yet you're sort of made invisible. And I just think that was strange. And all these amazing women who had their own careers and their own talents, like, Maureen and Jane Asher and Cynthia and Patty Boyd, who are all kind of swept up in this, but they're sort of kept outside the official record of it. I mean, obviously Patty Boyd is a big part of the story because she meets George during the shooting, which is I think I describe it as a meta meet cute, which is quite lovely.
Yeah, that's great. I've always thought Cynthia's one of those remarkable lives that's probably not quite had its story suitably told. And I think the wonderful way that Julian continues to carry himself says so much about her. Yeah.
And how interesting that he himself is an artist and musician. That there's an artistry that he's inherited, and from both his parents. Obviously, Cynthia was a very talented artist in her own right. But, one of the other things I'll just mention again is, the social change. Cynthia only had to marry John because she fell pregnant. And people think, the pill began in 1963. The pill was only available to married women on the NHS until 1967. So you had to make a decision to get an illegal abortion or to get married or to risk all the stress of being a single mother. And as we know, our Prime Minister recently apologised for the fact that women into the 1980s, and I think even early 90s, single women were being forced to give up their babies for adoption by the state because it was deemed that you were a bad person and you couldn't possibly bring up a child as a single woman. I mean, that was going on in this country, when it wasn't because of a religious state, it was just the nanny state telling young women what they could and couldn't do with their bodies. And I just think we should remember that this is a big part of the story too,
I had no idea.
Yeah.
It's been fascinating to sit and speak with you, and I'm so glad that you gave me the time to do it. Thank you for sharing some of your journey so far. What is next on the road ahead for you?
Oh, my God. First of all, just how thrilled I am to be on this podcast. I've done a couple of things with Australian radio when the Stowe tape came out, and I just feel like Australians have a brilliant take on the Beatles and their role in culture. So thank you. I know I want to write something more. I'm wary of writing anything else about the Beatles at this stage. I kind of feel nervous about what would I really contribute that's necessary. But they'll continue to fascinate me. And so I'm going to write something else pop culture related. I mean, it'll be that whole intersection of social change and pop culture. So I've got some ideas. So watch this space. Can I mention one other thing? Because we have quite a good following in Australia for this, which is I do a podcast called Through the Square Window with Graham Kibblewhite. And we look at vintage television over the years. We take a month and a year. So we kind of did, I think July 1996, for example. And we take a bunch of programmes. We do some specials. We did, for example, we did a whole special with Graham Garden. And a lot of it was about the goodies, which I know was particularly loved in Australia because it was repeated here a lot more than it was in the UK. So I've got a lot of specials like that. So we've done about 12 episodes so far. It's usually monthly, but we're trying to up it to fortnightly. But there are more specials to come. We've done one with Joy Whitby, which is coming out next month, who is the creator of Play School in Jackanory. And she's about 95 now. She's a really good friend of mine, an amazing woman. Went on to make Cat Weasel, if you saw that in Australia, and The Book Tower with Tom Baker. Really interesting woman.
Have you done a deep dive into Space 1999 or any of the Jerry Anderson?
Well, in the debut episode, we did September 1975, which included the first episode of Space 1999 and the first episode of Fawlty Towers. That's a great one, actually. We've done a special with Mark Gatiss. But yeah, you know me, I love Space 1999. And I've interviewed Nick Tate, Alan Carter, Australian heartthrob to the world of science fiction.
Yeah, it's funny. I used to be a show announcer many years ago at SeaWorld here on the Gold Coast, and
oh yeah,
I remember we were doing a sea lion presentation, and in the audience, as I'm announcing, I spot Nick Tate. This is like 1998 or something, you know. And I thought, I know exactly who that is. You know, I was a fanboy. And as the show's ended, I made my way through the audience, and we had a good chat for about 5 or 10 minutes. He was very generous. And we talked about Martin Landau and what it was like on set. And one of those little moments that just kind of came out of nowhere that I was happy to have had, you know.
Oh, excellent. Well, I wrote a whole feature on Space 1999 for a magazine, which I can send you, actually. I'll dig it out, the PDF if you want. But I interviewed Nick for that, and Catherine Schell, and quite a few people. And I had met Martin Landau some years back. I interviewed him for the World Service. Lovely man. You know, he dated Marilyn Monroe, Martin Landau.
I had no idea.
He dated Marilyn Monroe, and James Dean was his best friend at drama school. There are photographs.
Wow.
Of him.
What a life you've had and continue to have. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike, and thank you so much for what you said about my book. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Good luck with everything ahead.
Thank you.